King Gray was the most feared Chad alive who conquered worlds, but died as a pathetic, lonely loser in his empty palace, realizing this legendary king had everything except someone who actually gave a damn about him. This godlike ruler gets reincarnated as a powerless village nobody, but now he's got the one thing his past life lacked: a loving family that makes this former world destroyer feel more alive than all his kingly power ever did. Everyone sees a weak farmer boy while this legendary conqueror uses his royal memories to speedrun back to godlike strength. Except this time, he's not building empires. He's protecting the people who finally make his miserable existence worth living. And it all started with the most ironic death ever. This unstoppable war machine who survived countless assassinations and epic battles gets taken out by a simple poisoned drink in his own bedroom. As King Gray's soul drifted toward that famous bright light everyone talks about, his final memories came flooding back, standing by his window overlooking the city he ruled, crawling under silk sheets that suddenly felt impossibly heavy, and the bitter realization that after conquering half the world, some coward finally got him with the oldest trick in the book. There was a sword and crown displayed nearby. After all, Gray had been a legendary king in his previous life. With his death now behind him, he could only accept whatever came next. He just hoped the afterlife wouldn't involve floating babies with wings singing hymns. The light grew brighter as voices congratulated a man and woman on their healthy baby boy. Blurry outlines appeared, and Gray realized he is being born. A woman asked her husband to help her sit up so she could see him better. The former king briefly wondered if the tunnel's light was just the delivery room, but quickly dismissed the thought. Alice, his new mother, called him beautiful, while Ray, his new father, pointed out he had her hair. With both parents smiling down at him, Gray noticed he could understand their language perfectly, definitely a good sign. His mother's gentle smile radiated pure love, and Gray couldn't help but admire his beauty. When she mentioned he had his father's eyes, Gray studied the man's strong jaw and sharp eyebrows, expecting a stern personality. Instead, his father waved cheerfully and asked him to say, "Daddy." Ray laughed when his wife reminded him that babies can't talk yet. And then they named their child Arthur. With armor pieces hanging on the walls and candles flickering in the corners, Arthur's surroundings seemed normal enough. His new parents lived in a white-walled house with a thatched roof surrounded by open fields. The weeks crawled by as Arthur adapted to his infant body. Despite Alice's gentle nature, she clearly ran the household with an iron fist. Ray proved himself a reliable father, though he had his childish moments. While Arthur appreciated being born into a loving family, his previous life's hardships made him cautious about getting too comfortable. His baby body betrayed him constantly, flailing limbs, dirty diapers, and complete loss of bodily control. When Alice changed his diaper, Arthur's face burned with embarrassment. Only his mental training as a king and the slim hope this was all a dream kept him from losing his sanity entirely. Alice carried her baby through the bustling marketplace while Arthur observed his new world. With people carrying massive swords and wearing old-fashioned clothing, he realized he'd been sent back to a much earlier time period. A shopkeeper shouted about stamina elixirs for only 2 coppers, holding up bottles of murky liquid. The former king noticed these questionable potions were actually being sold as real medicine. When Alice asked if he was getting tired, Arthur's face clearly showed his displeasure. A customer yelled that she'd take 3 elixirs for her husband, so Alice decided to head home. Now lying on his pillow, Arthur spent his time studying this world. With weeks of observation complete, he felt confident about what to expect from medieval life. Ray came home announcing that Daddy was back, picked up his son, and tossed him into the air without warning. Alice screamed at her husband about what would happen if the baby fell. Arthur's weak infant body immediately felt nauseous from the simple throw, and he stayed helpless in his father's arms. Ray laughed at his son's pathetic reaction and held him at arm's length, explaining that his own father had done the same thing when he was young. With his royal dignity completely destroyed by basic parenting, Arthur realized his previous life meant nothing in this uncooperative baby body. Ray told his wife their baby was having fun while Arthur turned purple and screamed from the sudden spinning. Alice shouted at her husband as the baby got seasick again. When Ray bumped his son's foot against the wall, both parents froze in horror. The baby wailed in pain while Ray sat in the corner nursing the lumps on his head from Alice's retaliation. Alice soothed her crying son, telling him everything would be okay. She placed her glowing palm against his bruised knee and asked him to let Mommy fix it. A bright light appeared from her hands, and Arthur watched in amazement as the scrape healed completely. Alice picked him up, declaring that everything was much better now. The baby stared at his mother's hands, realizing he'd completely misjudged this world. In his previous life as legendary king, he'd commanded armies and defeated enemies with advanced weaponry and mechanical war horses. He'd conquered representatives from countries across the globe, standing victorious over fallen opponents. But despite all those achievements, he'd never encountered real magic. Arthur smiled slightly and looked forward with fresh determination. Now he could crawl. His parents watched nervously as Alice warned Ray about the sharp corner, while Ray pointed out the dangerous shelf nearby. The child immediately crawled straight into the mirror, bonking his forehead and sitting down to examine his reflection. Both parents cooed affectionately about Arthur admiring himself. Several months had passed, but he still hadn't adjusted to his adorable new name. Arthur seemed far too cute for a former king. The little boy pressed his palms against the mirror, though he had to admit his reflection was absolutely precious. With renewed confidence, Arthur decided future ladies better prepare for heartbreak. His parents laughed as Alice kissed his cheek. After his mother tucked him in and wished him sweet dreams, Arthur waited for her footsteps to fade. He opened his eyes, raised his hands dramatically, and declared his mission had begun. With the blanket thrown to the floor as a landing pad, Arthur climbed over the railing and dropped down with complete determination. Now that Alice thought he was asleep, he had about an hour before she'd check on him again. Arthur crawled forward with purpose, glancing back at his mother washing dishes. With his goal finally within reach, he picked up speed and made it through the open door. The study room stretched before him, packed with countless books on towering shelves. Arthur clenched his tiny fist in triumph and settled onto the floor with a satisfied grin. Ever since discovering this treasure trove, he'd been sneaking here nightly to study his new world. Arthur found a map showing the continent of Dicathen divided into 3 main kingdoms. The kingdom of Elenoir, the Elven kingdom, hid deep within forests filled with horned beasts. The kingdom of Darv stretched underground as a massive dwarven realm of stone houses. The kingdom of Sapan, the human kingdom, boasted the largest population with its grand castle and sprawling cities. The kid pulled a heavy book toward himself and toppled backward from its weight. Unlike his previous world's merit-based system, this realm operated on pure hereditary monarchy. Arthur held the book above his head with outstretched arms, quickly understanding why this world lagged so far behind technologically. With a candle flickering on the table, Arthur spotted exactly what he needed, a beginner's guide for privileged magicians. Magic explained everything. He concentrated on flipping through the pages, realizing this was where his investigation had stalled before. Symbols and drawings filled every page. In his old world, warriors trained to harness a life force called Kai to strengthen their bodies and weapons. Here, a similar energy called mana existed everywhere, not just within people. Arthur lay sprawled on the floor, absorbing the book's contents. Only about 1 in 100 children inherited the ability to control mana, and he scratched his itchy diaper rash while reading about the 2 most common applications, enhancement and spellcasting. Arthur studied the diagrams showing how enhancers channeled mana through their bodies for incredible strength and defense, though their attacks remained limited to close range. Spellcasters projected mana outward to manipulate their environment, but they needed to constantly refill their internal mana cores from external sources. The book showed a cloaked figure healing wounded people. His mother Alice was what they called a deviant, specifically an emitter who used rare restorative mana. Arthur remembered her glowing hands fixing his scraped knee perfectly. According to the text, magical awakening occurred between early and late adolescence when the mana core first manifested. Arthur touched his chin thoughtfully. This sounded exactly like the Kai centers from his previous life. Children learn to meditate, sense scattered energy fragments inside their bodies, and gather them into one central location. Arthur sat cross-legged and closed his eyes, focusing on the meditation techniques. A warm light appeared inside his chest, and he smiled with satisfaction as the familiar sensation took hold. Alice suddenly scooped him up with a worried smile, asking where he'd been hiding. Then she paused, wrinkling her nose, and asked if he needed the toilet. Arthur cursed internally. Just as he was beginning his journey as the world's greatest mage, his baby body had betrayed him again. Green smoke wafted from his diaper as Alice laughed and declared it was changing time. Arthur's face burned red as he realized his meditation had been interrupted by a very unglamorous bodily function. Alice sat at her writing desk, dipping her quill in ink to update her journal. Over 2 years had passed since Arthur's birth, yet she discovered something new about her son every day. She watched Ray help their boy practice walking steps. Arthur beamed confidently, convinced he was the most adorable child alive. Alice held her chestnut-haired, blue-eyed son, noting how his gaze seemed almost unnaturally intelligent. She knew without strict parenting, this clever boy would cause serious trouble, and she certainly couldn't count on Ray for discipline. Alice spotted Ray holding a wooden stick while teaching their son sword techniques. When she turned around, her death glare made Ray freeze completely. She wrote in her journal that she'd stopped her husband from teaching combat skills to a child who could barely crawl. Alice walked through town with Arthur reaching toward the weapon shop's displayed knives. She'd noticed her son loved visiting the small merchants in Ashbur, so instead of weekly grocery trips, they visited the city center every other day. Arthur stretched his tiny hands toward shiny gemstones while watching a ring-wearing magician conjure flames. Alice wrote that she wasn't spoiling him. These daily trips provided fresh food and educational opportunities. She studied her rapidly growing son, wondering what profession he'd choose as an adult. Her pen scratched across the paper as Alice predicted Arthur would follow Ray's path toward adventure. She couldn't help worrying he'd end up like those naive teenagers who dreamed of heroic careers. She glanced at her son crawling nearby, wishing she could break his habit of sneaking into the study every night. Alice scooped Arthur off the study floor, considering moving his bed into the room permanently. But the next day, she slammed her diary shut, placed her quill in the inkwell, and left the study with a frustrated sigh. Arthur stood by the window watching Ray pull off his work gloves. After nearly 2 years of difficult learning, Arthur had absorbed countless lessons, but still found something exciting to discover daily. His father positioned himself in the courtyard with both hands extended forward. Ray frowned in concentration, mumbling incantations for several minutes. The man stood with outstretched arms as stones began lifting from the ground. Power radiated around Ray as more rocks rose higher into the air. Arthur watched with fascination as his father raised both hands, controlling the floating stones with precise movements. Ray spread his legs for stability, swung his arm forward, and launched the projectiles across the yard. When he opened his eyes and turned around, he spotted his son observing through the window. Ray struck a heroic pose, declaring that Daddy was amazing. Arthur stared gloomily at the display, thinking that 3 minutes of intense concentration to throw rocks seemed far less efficient than just picking them up and hurling them manually. Alice's hand landed on his head as she asked with a smile if he'd been watching Father's training. She glanced outside and groaned that Ray had destroyed the front yard again. Arthur had recently learned his father was an enhancer and wondered what type of mage he'd become when his own mana core awakened. Ray positioned himself in the courtyard, clenched his fists, and began his daily combat routine. A falling leaf drifted past as he threw punches, kicks, and elbows that left visible energy trails in the air. He finished with a circular hand motion and deep exhale. Arthur smiled at his father's dedication, then turned away from the window. Suddenly he realized he was standing on a bench, looking down at a terrifyingly distant floor. His face went pale as he knelt down and shakily began lowering one leg toward the ground. Ray noticed his son's half-closed, exhausted eyes. Alice scooped Arthur up with a kiss, declaring someone needed a nap. The boy pointed desperately toward the study, reaching for his books. She smiled and said not now, maybe after sleep time. Arthur scowled at having no choice in the matter. He pushed against her arms with shining, pleading eyes focused on the study. Alice squinted from his adorable radiance, groaned in defeat, and agreed he could play with books for a short while. She carried him toward the study, thinking she was a terrible mother since normal children his age just played with toys. Arthur entered the study thinking this manipulation wasn't humiliating. Great warriors used every available weapon. Alice watched him settle with a book before hearing a crash outside. She left quickly, muttering that Ray better not have chopped down another tree. Arthur turned his attention to his greatest achievement beyond accumulated world knowledge, his developing mana core. He sat in meditation pose, having spent 2 years carefully moving tens of thousands of tiny mana fragments and gathering them near his solar plexus where warm light now pulsed steadily. Arthur sat with closed eyes, understanding why natural mana core formation took until adolescence. His lips pressed together as he watched countless fragments crawl slowly toward his body's center. The difficult task strained both his young body and mind as he meditated beside the open book, tongue sticking out from concentration. The glow in his chest grew brighter as Arthur realized he was nearly finished. Just one final fragment remained to complete his mana core. Outside, Ray held a broken tree branch while Alice offered him a glass of water with a smile. Arthur focused on the last glowing piece of mana when suddenly a deafening explosion erupted behind his mother. Ray yanked Alice toward himself, shielding her from flames with his back as the shockwave hit them. Fire streamed stronger as Ray grabbed Alice's hand and leaped aside from another explosion. Everything around them burst into flames while Ray held his wife, trying to calm her panic. Alice looked back at their burning house in horror, struggling against her husband's grip while screaming that Arthur was still inside. Ray clenched his teeth and charged into the blazing wreckage, pushing aside burning debris to reach the house. When he climbed inside, his eyes widened in complete shock. He fell to his knees with trembling lips as tears streamed down his face. Alice rushed to her husband, asking what happened. Ray stared ahead and stammered that this had to be some kind of joke. Alice gasped in amazement, pointing out that Arthur wasn't even 3 years old yet. Their baby floated serenely in midair while both parents hugged each other in stunned silence. Arthur gently landed, put his hands behind his back, and smiled cheerfully. He felt absolutely fantastic after completing his mana core formation. Arthur clenched his fist, thinking how amazing it was to possess a mana core. He spread his arms wide, noting that even the trees looked different now. Standing in the middle of their completely destroyed house, Arthur looked around at the devastation with genuine confusion and asked his parents who had dared attack the king's residence. Arthur lay on his bed reflecting on the busy year since their house's restoration. His mother had taught him reading and writing while showing him various books about mana manipulation and enhancement. His father introduced training diagrams, though Arthur remained frustrated that his small body couldn't handle proper sparring yet. Ray had taught him basic exercises, sit-ups, push-ups, and running drills that left the child exhausted. Not long ago, his father finally decided Arthur was ready for sword practice and gave him a wooden training blade for his 3rd birthday. Arthur's reading was interrupted when Ray burst through the door, loudly announcing training time while brandishing his practice sword. Papers scattered as they positioned themselves in the street facing each other. Ray raised his stick and explained that combining mana flow with breathing should feel as natural as his heartbeat or lungs. The core was just another organ. Arthur stared in bewilderment, wondering if most 4-year-olds could grasp such abstract instructions. The child prepared to attack, glaring furiously at his father before launching forward. He struck repeatedly at Ray's stick, but his father parried each blow with an encouraging smile and laughter, declaring his belief in Arthur's eventual success. Arthur grew increasingly frustrated, knowing Ray wouldn't let him rest until he succeeded. With limited time before dinner, the boy gathered his energy, opened his eyes abruptly, and focused intensely. Ray watched with confusion as Arthur smiled confidently, swung hard, and shattered the wooden stick completely. The broken pieces spun away and clattered to the ground while Ray stared in shock, clearly not expecting such power. Arthur squatted politely and asked if he could visit the study now, receiving his father's stunned consent. In the study, Arthur sat cross-legged on his bed, visualizing energy accumulation techniques. Strength in this world was measured by core color. Natural cores formed black from blood and impurities mixing with mana particles during development. Arthur focused on imagining a different type of core entirely. Over time, cores became purer as impurities filtered out through the progression: black, red, orange, yellow, silver, and finally white. Core. Arthur imagined a white bucket while considering how each stage divided into 3 shades: dark, solid, and light. The lighter the core, the cleaner and more energy it contained. A loud dinner call interrupted his concentration, making Arthur frown with clear annoyance. He trudged to the table where his parents ate contentedly while he stabbed his meat with obvious dissatisfaction, thinking he desperately needed solitude for proper study. Arthur dramatically clanged his fork and knife to express his frustration. Ray suggested hiring Arthur a real mentor, causing Alice to leap up and point her staff at her husband. She screamed that their son was only 4 years old as an army of enchanted carrots appeared, firing vegetable arrows at Ray. Alice glared furiously while Ray materialized armor and his own vegetable army, declaring this was exactly what Arthur needed. Ray crossed his armored arms, admitting he'd never expected their son to show such prodigious mana manipulation at age 4. He was clearly holding Arthur back when the boy had tremendous potential. An explosion thundered as Alice launched her carrot army forward in a full dining room battle. The parents argued intensely while Arthur continued eating silently. Alice declared she wouldn't allow her child to leave for some city hundreds of miles away, while Ray insisted this wasn't just any city and his friend would personally care for Arthur. Both parents suddenly stopped fighting and hung over their son with determined expressions. Ray announced that Arthur should decide for himself whether he wanted a real teacher in the big city. Arthur squinted with food crumbs around his mouth, confused why his parents expected a 4-year-old to make such a serious decision. He swallowed loudly, set down his utensils, looked at both parents, and declared they needed to travel together and meet this teacher first. Ray looked at Alice with satisfaction while she stared back in surprise. Arthur worried he'd said something wrong or made an impossible suggestion. Alice touched her chin thoughtfully as both parents burst into laughter, admitting they hadn't considered traveling together. Alice leaned on her hand, explaining she'd feel much better being there when Arthur met his potential teacher. Ray slammed the table so hard their plates jumped, declaring they'd all go to Zyra City together. Arthur sat shocked as his parents immediately began planning their 3-week journey. That night, Arthur studied his book carefully, feeling like he'd seen it somewhere before. Alice approached, took the book away, and announced bedtime since they were leaving tomorrow. Arthur climbed into bed, confused by the sudden rush. Alice tucked him in, admitting she also hated hurrying. Under his blanket, Arthur listened as his mother explained that old family friends would escort them to the city. His father had once adventured with this group. She kissed his forehead and headed for the door, adding that if she didn't catch him reading again, he could bring a few books for the journey. Arthur agreed and wished her good night, receiving the same in return as darkness filled his room. He knew the Horns twins had been in their area recently, even helping restore their house. Arthur raised his hand toward the ceiling, thinking about the group's composition, 2 mages and 3 enhancers who could handle any difficulties. Finally, he'd leave this small, quiet town and discover what this world truly offered. Morning arrived as the family traveled through the forest on a wonderful long road, spotting someone waving in the distance. A red-haired young man named Adam Crench approached and hugged Ray, who thanked him for including them on this trip. Ray gestured toward Arthur, asking him to introduce himself. Arthur bowed politely, introducing himself as Arthur Lewin. Adam patted the boy's head, praising his manners while his red hair fluttered in the wind. The intimidating dagger at his side gleamed as he knelt, still ruffling Arthur's hair, and questioned whether Ray was truly his father. Adam is the conjurer, a spear specialist. A beautiful blonde named Angela Rose suddenly grabbed Arthur by the arms, declaring him too precious and telling him to be thankful he looked more like his mother. Angela is also a conjurer, but specializing in wind magic. Arthur found himself pressed against her chest, thinking desperately that he couldn't breathe. Someone lifted him by the scruff of his neck, saying Angela was hurting him. A massive but kind-looking man named Durden Walker carefully set Arthur on the ground and patted his shoulder gently. Durden specializes in earth magic. The big friendly giant reminded Arthur of a gentle dog as he smiled and raised his finger cheerfully. In the distance sat a brunette with melancholy eyes, Jasmine Flamesworth, specializing in dual daggers. She lowered her head and walked silently toward the cart. Another beautiful brunette approached Arthur, telling him not to mind Jasmine since she just needed time to warm up to everyone. She extended her hand with a bow, introducing herself as Helen Shard, specializing in magic bow. Ray clapped his hands and announced it was time to move out. They loaded everything into their carts with considerable effort. The group asked if everyone was ready as Alice and Arthur settled inside one cart, confirming they were fine. 2 carts pulled by fast, massive lizards began rolling forward through incredibly beautiful landscapes. Arthur gazed into the distance as their journey officially commenced. Darkness fell as the adventurers battled monsters while Alice cooked over their campfire. Ray and Jasmine dragged massive wolf carcasses back to camp where everyone gathered around the flames. Arthur propped his head on his hand, clearly exhausted. Helen approached and asked how he was feeling, noting his obvious tiredness. Arthur waved his arms wearily, admitting he was worn out. She sat beside him, explaining this was his first real journey and mentioning that Ray had bragged the entire trip about his genius son. She asked if Arthur had truly awakened his mana core a year ago. Adam watched their conversation, then stood up and stretched, announcing he needed to loosen up before bed. He reminded everyone that Ray had agreed to let Arthur train and asked if they could spar now. Arthur frowned, thinking Adam should just stretch alone. Ray looked at his son and agreed, but warned Adam to be careful since Arthur had barely progressed beyond basic mana exercises. Adam grabbed Arthur by the scruff and lifted him up while his parents watched their son get carried away. The opponents faced each other as Adam grinned and asked if Arthur was ready. He began swinging his sword while asking if Arthur knew weapon enhancement techniques. A massive tiger manifestation appeared behind Adam, making Arthur look away in fear as everyone watched. Arthur glanced at his father telepathically, pleading to be rescued from this bloodthirsty situation. Instead, Ray raised his fist with a smile and mentally encouraged Arthur to give it everything he had. Arthur hung his head, thinking his father was completely useless. He closed his eyes, then snapped them open with fierce determination. A kingly aura manifested behind Arthur as he gripped his wooden sword tightly and gathered his energy. He launched forward, charging straight at Adam. Adam smiled confidently, taking his stance and preparing to strike. When Arthur's blade came dangerously close, Adam frowned and blocked, then manipulated his sword to send the boy flying sideways. Arthur pushed off the ground immediately and charged again, cursing his infantile body's limitations. Adam spun around in surprise, smiling as Arthur's sword began glowing. The boy swung and attacked again while Adam struck back, but Arthur leaped and flew at him with his full weight, knocking the man sideways. In mid-flight, Arthur swung again while staring directly into Adam's eyes. Adam tried to kick him, but Arthur dodged and landed, looking up at the rapidly approaching redhead who swung his weapon. In that split second, Newton's third law flashed through Arthur's mind. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Adam strikes sent Arthur flying backward, his sword clattering away as he hit the ground hard. Alice screamed in fear while Arthur lay there in pain, struggling to get up with bruised elbows. Durden marched over and smacked Adam on the back of his head, scolding him for hitting too hard. Adam rubbed his head and demanded to know who had taught Arthur to fight like that, asking what hellish training had created this little monster. Ray smirked and looked away, denying he'd taught those techniques. Alice knelt beside her son, healing his injuries while asking if Ray had secretly trained him. Arthur raised his hands and explained he'd learned by watching his father and reading books. Everyone stared in bewilderment books. The group begged Arthur to teach them his movement techniques. Arthur smiled and began explaining how to cross your back leg over your lead leg, then kick off with mana while letting your body fall forward. He watched Helen tumble to the ground while Adam flew backward into a tree with a loud crash. Arthur walked over to find Adam's head embedded in the trunk, giving a thumbs up from inside the wood. Several days passed on their journey to Xyrus City. Alice bathed Arthur while the adventurers jumped from cliffs into the water below. During this time, his birthday had come and gone. Arthur looked away as Jasmine approached with a dagger, explaining it was his birthday present and first lesson. Adam emerged from the water, shaking his red hair as everyone smiled and watched. Their training continued with decent progress while Durden got launched off the cliff, creating massive splashes. Arthur noted that Helen had somehow mastered several techniques already. The adventurers played on the shore, splashing and tickling each other while Arthur puzzled over how Helen grasped his movement instructions so quickly, especially the phantom step technique. Under the bright sun, Angela healed Helen's training injuries as Alice called for Arthur to pack faster since they were departing immediately. Arthur stuffed items into his bag with a smile, saying he needed to hurry. They traveled through a strange gorge where massive footprints marked the ground. Under clear skies, the group reminisced about Ray getting them into various troubles. Adam approached Arthur with a grin as everyone laughed. Helen added that Adam wasn't the only troublemaker, mentioning a time they accidentally went to. She glanced at Adam, who quickly interrupted, claiming it was just a small rodent incident. Helen looked disappointed. Arthur approached Helen and asked if she was okay, but she smiled and replied she was just tired. Arthur placed his hand on her shoulder while holding his book, then continued reading. Something was clearly bothering him as he tensed up and looked away. Helen's eyes filled with fear as she peered through a crack in the rocks, asking Arthur to teach her more techniques. Arthur stared ahead, then lowered his eyes to his book as everything suddenly shook violently. Helen spun around, asking what happened. Jasmine shouted the bandits were attacking and they needed to prepare for battle. Angela extended her dagger and commanded the wind to gather and protect them. Strong winds deflected arrows that flew straight at their cart. Arthur looked sideways and saw Helen already in a fighting stance. His father prepared for battle while Durden grabbed his staff and Adam stepped forward. An arrow pierced Adam's leg, but he pulled it out without flinching, jumped back, and took aim. Arthur and Alice huddled inside the cart, terrified as strange creatures surrounded them. Arthur realized they were completely encircled by bandits with bows hiding in the grass. He spotted a scarred chest and gleaming axe among their attackers. The bandit leader drove his axe into the ground with a nasty grin covering half his face, declaring this was quite a catch. An ugly man with thick lips looked them over and ordered his men to keep only the women and child alive without leaving scars since damaged goods brought less money. Arthur realized he'd been sheltered too long in their peaceful village. Watching the terrible man mock them with his subordinates, Arthur remembered that every world contained its share of human filth. He pursed his lips and looked up, thinking bitterly about being called damaged goods. Arthur gripped his small wooden sword with deadly seriousness. Alice stared at him in terror and pulled him close, hiding him beneath her trembling body. She whispered that everything would be okay, since she was protecting him. Arthur felt surprised at first, then relaxed slightly under her embrace. Arrows began flying straight toward their cart as the horns rushed to defend them, shouting orders to protect the civilians. They deflected projectiles while Durden built an earthen wall, but arrows kept coming toward mother and child. Angela fought them off with wind magic while the bandits grew increasingly angry. Jasmine attacked from behind her stone barrier, but the bandits skillfully avoided her shots. Ray suddenly leaped from the cliff straight at one robber, landing so hard that stones scattered in all directions. He crushed his target, then spun toward the others like a human bullet. Ray began eliminating enemies one after another, crushing one bandit while grabbing another by the head. A sword-wielding bandit appeared above him, but Jasmine's arrow killed the attacker instantly. Ray turned and nodded his thanks as she returned the gesture. The battle intensified as Jasmine killed bandits systematically while Ray matched her pace. Adam looked forward furiously, eliminating thugs as dust flew from his rapid movements. He pointed his blade forward and impaled the bandit leader, though he was clearly tiring. Jasmine mercilessly slaughtered multiple enemies at once, her eyes burning with pure rage. One bandit with multiple rings wielded a whip, striking at her, but she jumped back as he accidentally killed his own comrades instead. She landed gracefully as if nothing had happened. The whip wielder approached again, telling her to stop resisting since he'd train her properly until she begged to stay with him. She stared at him briefly before he struck again, but she dodged backward with incredible speed. The whip clearly struck Jasmine's face and hand as she stood against her opponent. Arthur watched, thinking she was at a disadvantage and wondering how he could help with his small body. Suddenly, something massive crashed into their cart, smashing it to pieces. It was Ray, exhausted and bleeding from his mouth. Arthur and Alice stared in terror at Ray's condition. Arthur turned and saw the terrifying bandit leader who had done this to his father. He shouted for his mother to heal Ray faster, but Alice looked at him through tears, saying she couldn't. Arthur wondered why his mother wouldn't heal his father. While Alice worked on him, Ray smiled and told her his wound wasn't fatal, she shouldn't worry and should do everything possible. Arthur looked aside in fear as his father called to him. Ray frowned and explained that once Alice finished healing, the bandits would target her. He could fight the leader but couldn't protect them simultaneously, so Arthur needed to take his mother back along their path without stopping. Arthur shouted that he wasn't leaving and would fight, since everyone knew how strong he was. Ray smiled and patted his son's head, saying he knew Arthur could fight. That's why he trusted him to protect his mother. Blood poured from Ray's mouth as he added that Arthur needed to protect not just his mother, but the baby inside her as well. Arthur suddenly remembered Ray holding Alice's stomach and her feeling unwell during the journey, claiming simple tiredness. He realized his mother was pregnant. Ray placed his hand on Arthur's head, leaning close and explaining he'd planned to tell him when they reached town. Arthur grabbed his father's hand, looked up, and promised to protect his mother. Ray told him to get ready as Alice finished healing. The bandit leader pointed at them furiously, shouting they had a healer who couldn't be allowed to escape. Arthur rushed to his mother's side, grabbed her hand, and declared they had to run immediately. Despite Alice trying to stop him, Arthur looked sternly ahead, determined that his father wouldn't die. Adam waved his hand and shouted for them to run while he held off the enemies. Arthur clenched his teeth as a bandit rushed toward them, but Adam intercepted him in fierce combat, promising to hold the line while they escaped. Mother and son disappeared into the distance as an archer took aim at them. Arthur sensed the danger and spun around just as an arrow flew toward them. He blocked it with his wooden sword, which cracked and shattered into pieces but stopped the projectile. The confused bandit was killed instantly by Jasmine, who shouted for Arthur not to stop running. They ran as fast as possible while Arthur realized something was wrong. Remembering the bandit leader mentioning 4 mages, he began counting enemies. Adam fought one, his father battled another, but Arthur couldn't locate the 4th adversary. The bandit leader, nearly defeated, ordered his men to abandon their plan and kill everyone. Arthur didn't understand who he was addressing until someone appeared in the air above them. The 4th mage created a water vortex and sent a massive torrent straight at them. Arthur realized that even if he could dodge, his mother wouldn't have time. Filled with rage, he abruptly stopped and mentally apologized to his mother before pushing her aside. Alice screamed as Arthur let the water engulf him, but he hurled Jasmine's dagger toward the whirlpool. The blade pierced the mage's knee as Arthur created an invisible mana thread connecting him to the weapon. Using this connection, he flew up toward the cliff while his hands shook and feet scrambled for purchase. The wounded mage teetered on the cliff's edge before both of them plummeted toward the bottom. Durden quickly created a massive stone hand that shot downward after them. Arthur fell through the air with tears streaming down his face, thinking everyone else would be safe now. As he cried, Arthur thought about how he'd always wanted to be an older brother. Arthur sat on a bed in a curtained room, then walked to the door and opened it. A servant girl waited with a plate as other servants greeted him with good morning wishes. He walked down a large corridor into the old man's office. The elderly councilman looked at him while Arthur studied a portrait on the wall depicting 3 people, the council who actually ran the country's politics and economy. Arthur then examined his own portrait. In this world of declining birth rates and resource constraints, wars had been replaced by duels between champion kings. The old man asked if Arthur admired his own portrait, then stood from his desk. He admitted that while council positions were useful, he envied the fame and glory kings received after victory. He approached Arthur and asked what he could do for him. Arthur grabbed the medallion around his neck, removed it, and placed it on the table. He left the room, announcing his resignation. Arthur put his hand to his forehead, wondering what his lifelong pursuit of strength had accomplished. Fame. Glory? He remained an orphan with everyone dear to him gone. He remembered the fire that had consumed everything. Arthur would give up everything in this life for one chance to return and see them again, to remember his squad laughing around their campfire. Light crept in as Arthur lay on the ground, confused about his location and survival. His narrowed eyes spotted something nearby, a broken, bloodied bandit corpse. Arthur turned away and vomited so violently that birds scattered from the noise. Now he lay in torn clothes, covered in his own sickness and surrounded by garden debris. A flower petal drifted down and landed on him. Arthur brushed it aside, raised his hand, and struggled to his stomach despite terrible pain. He reached desperately for a nearby berry, ate it hungrily, and washed it down with water. Arthur threw the flask aside and stared at the sky before his eyes closed again. He mentally thanked whatever had provided the berries as birds chirped overhead. Arthur opened his eyes and tried standing, but his weakness sent him crashing down again. He exhaled heavily and closed his eyes once more. His memories blurred as his small body lay motionless on the ground, his mana core completely black from overexertion. Suddenly he jumped up despite the intense pain and managed to stay on his feet. Arthur looked sideways and spotted the dagger embedded in the bandit's back. He pulled the weapon free so forcefully that he fell backward onto the ground. Looking up at the incredibly high cliff he'd fallen from, Arthur couldn't understand how he'd survived. Wondering how much time had passed, he grabbed a walking stick and surveyed the massive forest surrounding him. Arthur decided it didn't matter. He had to keep moving forward. Then he heard someone expressing happiness that he'd finally awakened. Arthur spun around in surprise, ready to attack. He hid behind a tree and stared at the bandit's lifeless body, thinking the voice came from the corpse. The mysterious voice asked how his body was feeling, making Arthur wonder if the bandit would somehow resurrect. He pounced on the corpse with his stick, but the voice assured him the dead body wouldn't come to life. Arthur exhaled in relief while still trying to locate the source of this unknown voice, no matter how smooth and dignified it sounded. Arthur brandished his knife and demanded to know who was speaking. Was this his savior? A rabbit hopped out of nearby bushes as the voice explained he'd learn everything once they reached home. Arthur said that someone spoke quite confidently, assuming he wanted to be found. The voice replied that it was the only one who could guide Arthur home from this place. Arthur grew frightened, remembering he desperately needed to return to his parents and wondering if they'd safely reach the city. Arthur sheathed his knife and walked forward resolutely. He coughed with embarrassment and asked if he could pose a question and request the honor of the voice's visible presence. The voice laughed so loudly that birds scattered from the trees. Arthur looked up as the voice told him he was catching on quickly, though it was rude to call a lady Mr., but his instincts were correct. Arthur felt surprised, wondering how this voice knew his name. His eyes lit up as the voice promised to show him. Arthur grabbed his head and crouched down as his vision blurred. The massive forest began moving around him while rocks shifted positions. He stared down with wild eyes as the voice recommended leaving immediately since travel would be safer during daylight hours. Throughout the day, Arthur's condition gradually improved, leaving him with only minor aches and pains. He climbed onto a huge tree trunk, pondering what magic she'd used to save him from the fall. How could she have known they were falling, and why did she speak only in questions? The more Arthur tried finding explanations, the more questions arose. His ears twitched as sounds surrounded him, growing closer and closer. Arthur dug around a rock formation, hoping desperately for what he was thinking. He felt surprised and delighted. He immediately undressed and jumped in, sending splashes everywhere while washing his clothes. The voice laughed and called him cute and carefree, startling Arthur terribly. He covered himself as the voice noted there wasn't much to see anyway, which seemed to offend him. Arthur felt upset while putting on his torn shirt, thinking these were just words and he should stay calm since his body simply wasn't developed yet. The voice apologized and asked him not to be offended. Arthur collected water in his flask and ate berries, thinking the mountain lay eastward, so he must be near the Alpha region. He looked up at the setting sun, noticing no fog despite this forest's reputation. Walking barefoot through the undergrowth, Arthur realized his fear of crossing animal territories was suppressed by finding only small creatures here. He felt surprised at not encountering a single mana beast since entering, despite this area's rich mana concentration. Arthur regretted not being able to stay and absorb some energy, but he needed to hurry home. Remembering his mother's eyes, Arthur knew he had to return to his parents. His beloved mother was pregnant, and stress from his potential death could endanger the unborn child. Arthur hoped desperately that they were still alive. Darkness fell as the voice expressed gladness that Arthur had made it out safely. He looked at a rock formation, then up at a bird, saying he was pleased to meet them. The voice clarified it wasn't her. He needed to enter the crevice where a faint glow emanated. Arthur swallowed loudly as he entered the dark crevice, thinking seriously about his parents and his imminent return home. Moving toward the light in the cave, he heard a warning to watch his step, but it came too late. The stones cracked beneath his feet, and he plummeted down through multiple levels. Arthur fell for what felt like an eternity before hitting the ground hard, smacking his cheek severely. He stood up, holding his face, thinking a warning about falling 2 floors would have been helpful. As he sat up and looked around in surprise, another stone disappeared beneath him. He fell again, turning back in horror to see what was happening. A massive stone creature stood before him, a horned stone woman who announced they'd finally met. She rose with dust cascading from her feet as her form stretched toward the ceiling. With heavy footsteps, she approached the terrified boy. The creature noted that bugs would fly into his mouth if he kept it open so wide. Arthur snapped his jaw shut as the monster narrowed her eyes, leaned toward him, and extended her hands. Arthur took her claw as she explained she needed time to open a spatial rift strong enough to take him home. She pointed to strange plants, saying they were special and would sustain him until then. Arthur bowed and thanked her, then examined the plants, thinking they looked ordinary enough. One berry protested, startling him. Remembering his parents eating fruit together, Arthur shook his head to dispel the sad memories. The monster reappeared behind him, sitting on one knee and warning that this berry tasted better, which frightened him. He burst the fruit and stood covered in its liquid. In the darkness, Arthur ate berries while the large stone being did the same nearby. He looked at her thoughtfully, then asked how he should address her. She answered that her name is Sylvia. Arthur asked if he could pose more questions, receiving permission, though she might not answer everything. Arthur raised his hand and began questioning her. With his fear of the monster's appearance slowly fading, he asked all the questions that had plagued him since awakening from his fall. Where was he? What was this place? Why was she alone? Where did she come from? How did she get wounded? And why had she saved him? Sylvia looked at him and said his first question was sufficient for now. This place was called the Sanctuary Zone, lying between the beast glades and the forest. She gestured to show him a mental map, explaining that nobody knew about this location because she protected it from approaching visitors, though such cases were extremely rare. Arthur was the first person to ever enter here. Arthur scratched the back of his head, saying she could call him Art, since that's what his family used as an affectionate nickname. Sylvia leaned over and agreed to use that name from now on. The stone woman continued speaking while Arthur watched her. Regarding his second question, she remained alone because she had nobody else to be with. She looked upward and added that many enemies desperately wanted what she possessed. Arthur felt upset as she touched her wound, explaining that during her last battle before escaping, her enemy had inflicted this injury. He listened attentively as she explained why she'd saved him. Sylvia stood and looked down at the boy, saying perhaps his courage had touched her, or maybe she simply felt lonely. She couldn't choose between the two reasons. The monster walked to her throne and apologized, explaining it was already night and she needed rest early. She had to be in good condition when working on the spatial rift tomorrow. Arthur looked at her and wished her good night, feeling sad as he gazed downward. He pitied her obvious loneliness. Sylvia suddenly remembered something she'd forgotten. She turned to him and said her vision couldn't reach where they were going, then smiled and assured him his family and friends were safe in case he was worried. Arthur beamed with joy, nearly crying from relief. Now certain of their safety, he couldn't hold back his tears and broke into a genuine smile. Time passed quickly. The boy played with her and watched as the woman picked berries, showing him her magic along the way. They slept together in an embrace and talked about different things when they weren't preparing the portal. While Sylvia sat in the lotus position telling him stories, weeks flew by in each other's company. The boy noticed that the woman never mentioned her past, and he began to understand that this mysterious creature was more than she appeared. Arthur sat on the cliff and meditated, feeling energy build around him. When he opened his eyes, he saw the creature picking berries below. Despite her frightening appearance, she was kind, gentle, and patient. She approached him with berries and asked if he had eaten lunch. These fruits were especially powerful and grew nowhere else in the forest. Arthur took the berry from her hand. The woman's gentleness reminded him of his mother, and he found himself thinking about home as he looked ahead into the distance. She scolded him harshly when he made mistakes. Clutching his head, the boy suddenly remembered those terrible bandits and the hostility he felt toward them. They didn't deserve to live, and he would hunt them down if any had survived. His anger flared as he clenched his fists and furrowed his brow. A massive hand flicked him hard. The boy flew sideways and crashed into a stone, scrambling to his feet while grabbing his head. He demanded to know what that was for. The enormous creature sat down beside him and said that while those bandits might deserve death, she had chosen not to save the magician who fell with him for the same reason. Before the boy could ask why, the woman cut him off. She was clearly upset. Letting hatred and gloom cloud his heart would only bring him pain, she explained. Instead, he should move forward in life. The boy held his aching head and listened intently. She continued speaking, warning him not to let sorrow and anger corrode his mind when facing challenges. He should learn from others and look to the future with hope. Only then would he truly win. She lay down next to him and gently stroked his head, regretting that she had flicked him too hard. A moral lecture from someone who looked like the embodiment of evil struck him as deeply ironic. The boy suddenly snapped back to reality. The woman asked why he wasn't eating his fruit. He scratched his head, said he was fine, and began eating. Blood oozed from the wound where she had hit him, and it seemed to be getting worse. She covered it and told him not to worry because it would heal with time. As the boy continued eating, she said she wanted to ask him something. The monster lowered her head and wondered aloud how he had formed a core at such a young age when people usually awaken their abilities at 12 or 13, already using techniques more advanced than many full-fledged mages. The boy smiled and replied that his parents always said he was a genius. The woman moved closer and suggested that maybe he could learn something new. When he asked what, she stepped away from him and screamed loudly, explaining that he could absorb mana while moving, and possibly even during combat if he became skilled enough. The boy was surprised and didn't understand how this was possible. The monster smiled and raised her hand. "People think too simply about mana," she explained. "You just start with small, simple movements and build from there." The boy stared at his hands, completely lost. He clenched his fist, then clenched it harder, and looked up, saying it was easier said than done. She replied that animals learn this naturally, but humans usually awaken much later when their bodies can't handle multitasking. Since this didn't apply to him, hard training would get him there. The boy clenched his fists again, smiled, and said he would do his best. The woman laughed and told him she expected nothing less. While she gathered energy for the portal, the boy trained relentlessly. He tripped and fell flat on his face, and the woman burst out laughing at his graceful display. Together, they continued training until he could fight effectively while maintaining steady mana flow. Sweat poured down his face as his hands trembled. He swung his stick once, twice, then pointed it forward. Looking at his hands, he saw energy flowing and couldn't believe it actually worked. The stone monster screamed with excitement that he had succeeded, but Sylvia lay motionless, blood pooling beneath her. The boy's triumph vanished instantly as terror gripped him. He sprinted to the woman, finding her surrounded by blood that stained his heels as he stepped into the growing pool. Trying to turn the massive creature over, he told her to hold on. Gathering all his energy, he screamed and managed to flip her. A loud crash echoed as her wound bled even more. Through his tears, he asked why she was getting worse so quickly. The energy portal grew larger behind them. Arthur looked at it and understood with horrible clarity. She was making herself worse by expanding the portal. He remembered her feeding him berries, their training sessions, her laughter, their conversations, even how she had terrified him at first. Now those memories felt like they were slipping away. The boy fell to his knees, finally understanding that maintaining the portal was killing her. She was sacrificing herself for him. His hands clenched into fists as tears streamed down his face. Then the monster gently stroked his head and told him everything was fine. The boy grabbed her massive hand and sobbed harder, asking how anything could be fine when she was dying because of him. Glowing berries surrounded them as the boy sobbed uncontrollably. He sat at her massive feet, finally crying like the child he was. She asked if he had calmed down yet, and he told her no through his tears. The rock creature pressed her hand to her chest and warned him they were running out of time together, adding that he shouldn't blame himself for her condition. The boy wiped his face and said he couldn't stop blaming himself since she was dying just so he could return to his family. The creature smiled and told him he was actually helping her escape this cave faster than she ever could alone. This made the boy cry even harder. Her fingers started melting into lava as she mentioned that her current name didn't match this form. Wings burst from her back while white fur sprouted across her body. The boy squeezed his eyes shut against the blinding light. When he opened them, a magnificent white dragon towered over him with stunning purple eyes, saying she finally looked like a proper Sylvia. The boy stared in shock and asked if she had always been a dragon. She said people called her that, but they needed to focus since her true form would attract unwanted visitors soon. Moving toward the swirling portal, she explained she needed her original shape to complete the magic. The boy asked who was coming. The portal flared with intense light, forcing him to shield his eyes. The dragon turned back and told him to pay attention because she had crucial information before they separated. She dropped a shimmering egg into his hands that felt both weightless and impossible to grip properly. Then she yanked a feather from her wing and instructed him to wrap the egg completely to mask its magical signature. Before he could ask what any of this meant, she rammed her snout into his stomach with tremendous force. Symbols blazed across his hand, searing into his skin like molten metal. The pain lasted only seconds before fading completely. The dragon told him the mark would activate when needed. Her eyes began dimming as she looked at the boy. He asked if she was all right, and with her remaining strength she moved closer and said she would open the portal now. There wasn't time to choose the exact location, but he should land somewhere near his parents. She had to move quickly. The boy asked if he was really leaving her behind like this. Stones crashed down from the ceiling as the cavern shook violently. The boy looked up in terror while the dragon covered him with her wings. Rocks smashed directly onto her back as a voice echoed from the shadows telling her to stop being stubborn and hand the boy over. A strange stone creature with horns like Sylvia's previous form stepped into view. He ordered her to surrender the boy immediately, promising to heal her wounds in exchange. The boy stared at the newcomer and realized he looked exactly like her earlier appearance. The creature approached while explaining that the woman had caused them considerable trouble by hiding here. More stones fell as incredible energy swirled around the dragon. She told the boy she needed to confess something important. Though she had intended to delay the transportation spell to spend more time with him, she looked at him sadly and asked for forgiveness. Bleeding heavily, she made one final selfish request and asked if he could call her Grandma just once. The boy grabbed her wing and clenched his teeth. He begged her to leave with him, insisting everything would work out fine if they escaped together right now. The dragon's eyes filled with tears as she closed them and shook her head, saying she couldn't go with him. Tearing her wing free, she said goodbye and immediately hurled him straight into the portal. The boy screamed through his tears, desperately pleading for her to come with him. The last thing he saw was her sitting calmly in front of the portal, and at the final second he shouted that she was his grandma. The dragon cried and closed her eyes with a smile, thanking him quietly. She remained sitting as his wand lay forgotten in the distance. The berries glowed brighter than ever while she whispered that he was her child. The boy woke up outside with his hand reaching toward the sky. He lay sprawled on soft grass with wind blowing around him. Turning his head to the side, he looked down and frowned slightly at the thick tree crowns spread out before his eyes. The boy clenched his teeth and realized she was gone forever, squeezing the grass in his hands as he understood he would never have another chance to see her again. He slammed his fists against the ground and screamed loudly, causing crows to rise into the air and fly high above the trees as the morning sun climbed over the forest. Arthur covered his face with his hand as memories of the 4 months spent with Sylvia spun through his mind, thinking about how it felt both long and short at the same time while he curled up into a ball, remembering how the dragon had treated him like family and taught him everything he lacked since coming to this world. Suddenly, rhythmic beats echoed in his mind, and the boy shot up from the ground with raised eyebrows, completely confused about what was happening. He lifted his hand and frowned deeply as Sylvia's voice greeted him directly in his head. And when he asked if it was really her, the dragon confirmed by introducing herself by name. Arthur raised an eyebrow in confusion as the dragon's voice explained that if he was hearing this message now, it meant she had revealed her true form to him. The boy remembered how the dragon had struck his body with her muzzle and realized she had left him this message beforehand, dropping his head to his knees in disappointment. The woman added that he wasn't ready for the complete truth yet, and her image appeared in front of him as Sylvia explained that his body belonged to a barely 4-year-old boy, and although his nobles had reached the dark red stage, he still wasn't strong enough. Arthur grabbed his clothes as she told him that her parting gift would determine his future magical development, based on how well he could use it. The boy raised an eyebrow and thought he never asked for this gift, preferring something else entirely. But the woman interrupted his thoughts and said she could imagine how he was feeling. A stream of mana began rising next to him as she acknowledged he probably felt sadness, anger, and guilt, but reminded him he had family to care for and a purpose to fulfill in this life. The boy noticed a white bundle with a powerful aura emanating from it as the dragon said all she wished was for him to embrace the joy and innocence of childhood and become someone she and his parents could be proud of. Arthur reached toward the glowing object as the woman explained that when his mana core passed the white stage, he would hear from her again and she would explain everything to him. The boy looked upset at the white bundle as the woman said goodbye until then, and Arthur stared ahead in shock as he heard Sylvia call him king before her voice faded completely. Arthur evening settled over the forest as he stood among the trees, questions continuing to torment him long after Sylvia's voice had faded. He wondered how long she'd known his true identity and how she'd even discovered it in the first place. Arthur placed the mysterious object in his bag, deciding only one thing was clear to him. Looking down at the ground, he realized that if he focused solely on training for revenge, this new life would become no different from his previous existence as legendary king. Arthur frowned and looked ahead, deciding to move only forward. He scratched the back of his head, realizing he needed to figure out his current location. With his bare foot, he pushed off from the grass and got into a stance. The next second, he tore from the spot at high speed. Arthur quickly climbed a tree and grabbed a branch, standing on it while leaning against the trunk. Even with mana enhancing his vision, his sight remained limited, but one thing was clear as he looked around the dense thicket. He was now deep in the Elshire forest. Arthur lowered himself to the branch and made a dash, jumping toward the next tree. He could barely use the mana rotation technique Sylvia had taught him as he reached for the nearest branch. He pushed off from it, thinking he could use magic for much longer now, but still wondered how he'd ended up in this location. Arthur stood on his feet, remembering Sylvia's words about him being near other people. He decided it didn't matter since he'd just continue exploring. He smiled at the thought that he was getting quite good at this monkey-like tree hopping. Suddenly Arthur frowned, hearing a scream. He quickly turned around, thinking it sounded human. He pushed off from the branch while holding onto the tree trunk and spotted a white canvas below. Arthur looked closely and noticed something suspicious as he jumped to a lower branch. He somersaulted and headed downward, landing on the next branch and pressing himself against the tree to observe the people below. Arthur twitched his ears slightly, hearing words and pleas for help. A dull thud echoed from below as Arthur opened his eyes in surprise. Men crowded around the back of a cart. One suggested getting ready to leave since only a few days separated them from this cursed forest. A bearded man smiled and asked if many people prized elven girls. Another man added that she was young too, definitely innocent, so she'd bring them serious money. Arthur watched silently as their leader shut the men up and ordered them to put her back in the carriage. Arthur squeezed his hand until his nails scratched the wood, staring at them ominously. These were clearly slave traders, and in the man's arms lay an unconscious, white-haired girl. That's all for today's video. If you enjoy recaps like this, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want the second part, please let us know in the comments. See you in the next one, and until then, check out this legendary recap.